He installed the cameras to protect his daughter. But one night, watching the screens, the Mafia boss realized something terrifying. The danger wasn't outside the house. It was already inside. And the one watching was part of it. At 3 in the morning, the security room looked less like a control center and more like a chapel for sleep. The only light was the blue that pooled from dozens of screens, a cold aurora that made Bramwell Rossy's face look younger in the hollows and harder at the jaw. The monitors were a small constellation pinned to a wall of plaster. Bedrooms, corridors, the terrace where frost gathered in winter, the playroom with its faded piano. Each window showed a fragment of a life he had tried to buy safety for. He watched them like ledgers, each frame a line item to be verified. On screen number 7, his daughter Addie lay propped in pillows, a scarf thrown over one foot where the muscles no longer obeyed. Her breaths were the only movement in the frame. Sometimes her fingers twitched, sometimes the curtain rearranged itself with the draft. Bramwell's thumb found the crease in the photograph he kept on the marble beside him and smoothed it, more out of habit than hope. He catalogued the hours she slept, the hours the nurse arrived, the times an aide adjusted the blanket. Protection, he told himself, was not affection. It was proof. Outside the room, the house himself hummed in his absence. Boilers ticking, the drain moving rainwater down to gutter, a distant clock. He had made this place a map, cameras in corners, sensors where the light fell, paths of movement traced and retraced until the property read like a city block of his own design. Each device was a notation in his private accounting. Each feed was to be reconciled against the ledger in the study. He believed in margins. He believed in margins the way other men believed in prayer. He believed in the cameras. The first time he saw Cassidy McKenna on his monitors, he wondered how such patience could feel like a strategy. The image was an ordinary one, a woman in a navy coat kneeling by a bed, palms open, voice low. The camera framed her at 3/4 view. The blue light softened her jaw. She did not hover over Addie the way some aides hovered, not leaning, not treating the body before her like a thing to be fixed. Cassidy waited for the smallest permission, a look, a blink, a finger reaching. She sang under her breath in a language Bramwell did not speak, an Italian lullaby that wove itself around the beeps and hums and made his monitors sound like a strange church. He had hired her as he had hired so many things, with a need and a ledger behind the need. She had been recommended by an agency the way furniture was recommended, someone to fill a slot and hold a routine. But on the screen she did something that no check could guarantee. She put her knee down, and the motion took away some of the angle of authority from the room. When Addie's eyes opened and managed a small, wet smile, Bramwell exhaled without meaning to. Gratitude settled like dust. For a few minutes he stopped measuring. Cassidy's methods were particular. She asked permission even when the question was rhetorical. "May I?" And waited as if the world responded. She hummed the lullaby again, this time in Italian words both rough and tender around the consonants. The sound braided into the hum of the monitors. She slid her hand along Addie's forearm with the ease of someone who had learned touch as an economy of time. She had a satchel, soft leather, the kind that scuffed in small crescents, and when she packed it, her fingers brushed the corner of a photograph tucked deep inside. The camera caught that thumb, a familiar gesture, a slow, precise tracing of paper's edge. He watched that thumb trace as if it might tell him whether the world outside his property had shifted. Men trace things for different reasons. A thief tracing the lock, a tradesman mapping a measurement, a clerk watching an account. Bramwell read gestures the way other men read a book. If you were Bramwell, would you trust the cameras or the caregiver? He asked it to the empty room, then to the small rectangle of light that showed the world unfolding. It was the question he expected his monitors to answer. If you were Bramwell, what would you do? Tell us below. The question settled into him like a stone. He admitted, inwardly, that the cameras had been a relief. They gave form to his watchfulness. They let him leave the room and bring his ledger to the study, allowing his mind to move on from every small worry, only to return and reconcile what the cameras had dictated. Cameras made absence accountable, but they also had a way of delivering things he had not intended to see. One night, 2 perhaps, Cassidy left her satchel in the sitting room, and in it, the photograph slid free. It was an image of a man in his mid-20s, chin stubborn, smile thin as if saving itself for better weather. Someone had taped the corner back down once. Bramwell found the photograph first on a monitor feed, the pan of a camera that captured the corridor as Cassidy passed, the bag swinging. The image, magnified by a zoom his technicians had set long ago for intrusions, sat on the screen. His thumb smoothed the corner he did not own. He knew the name without having said it aloud. Marcus Webb. The ledger remembered the city in a different alphabet. The Eastern District had been a line on one of his maps. It had a history he kept in margins. Names there came with footnotes, the kind you could not easily erase. Bramwell's mind tightened. The photograph became another account requiring reconciliation. He did not go to a public office or place a formal call. He had less need for soft-footed procedures. Information tended to find him as if it had been waiting for the right ledger to open. The house hummed, and the city, outside the estate's walls, did what cities do. It kept the stories that belonged to other lives. Bramwell listened for the shape of those stories. When pieces came back, snatches of a name, a date, a place, he folded them into a pattern. Every man's past was a column. The question was whether the column balanced. The cameras, which he had installed to protect his daughter, began to feel like an interrogator. They gathered gestures and held them up like testimony. Cassidy's visits to a rehabilitation clinic in a neighborhood Bramwell had long counted as a place to watch appeared in a sequence of clips that his monitors fed him like a slow accusation. He watched her walk through a sliding door, met a man on a bench, put a hand on his shoulder. He saw manufacture of care. He saw what could be construed as intent, too much proximity, too much familiarity. He found himself replaying moments, slowing frames down, trying to make motive legible in the smallness of human touch. The watching changed him. It taught him to narrate absence as evidence. A hand on a thigh became a plan. A lullaby could be a bribe. The very instruments he had trusted to remove danger began instead to draft stories about his own life and the lives of those he had hired into it. Watching did not make things safer so much as make them knowable in ways that required moral accounting. Cassidy, in the meantime, had a life outside of his lines of sight. In the daylight, she kept a small notebook, pages bound by masking tape, words written in a hurried script that pressed sentences together like people in an elevator. When the house was still and the rain came down on the cobbles, she would sit in her old car in the staff parking lot and breathe, throat moving around sentences she wrote as if writing could shore her up. For Marcus, for the ways the city had failed him, for a mother who had left. Her journal had rules: practical items first, small goals, walk to mailbox, 15 minutes of muscle work, then a record of what she had felt. She used language that was plain and sometimes raw. She used the lullaby as a salve, too, humming it into the tape recorder she carried tucked into the satchel beside the photograph. Bramwell could not see those private pages at first. He could only see the tidiness of Cassidy's work on the monitors, the way she put toys in certain positions to encourage movement, the way she sang and let a pause stretch like a hand extended. The footage was simple, humane. He watched Addie push itself toward a toy, and for a second, the house's mechanical heartbeat loosened. Then he saw the photograph again. The image of Marcus settled into a space he had kept closed. He told himself the program was logical. A stranger enters your child's room. There is reason to watch. He had been taught to weigh a threat the way other men weighed risk. Every variable in place, every outcome considered. But the house had no space for questions that wanted tenderness rather than suspicion. It excused none of his doubts. Watchers, thought Bramwell, made their own prisons. There was a moment, an indistinct hour, when he decided to look further, not simply at the feeds that showed Addie's bed, but at the small evidence that attached itself to Cassidy. He pulled up the corridor cameras and watched a replay of Cassidy leaving after a shift. The camera caught, for a heartbeat, the satchel bouncing against Cassidy's hip, the edge of that photograph catching the light, the thumb touching it. He slowed the footage. The thumb traced as if memory required the motion. Memory sometimes needed to be stroked, so it did not fray. He asked one of the men who served in quiet capacities to check a name. He did it in the same way he wrote checks, with detachment, as if the inquiry were another bill to be paid. There was language he preferred not to speak aloud when thinking of the Eastern District. Those syllables had been edged by events he had tried to keep at a distance. The returned answer was neither surprising nor innocent. The name carried the weight of a past accident, a night that had been in newsprint once and then covered. It carried scars and consequences, and a young man whose life had become small in its movements. The feeds began to accumulate. Cassidy in anechoic rooms with fluorescent light, handing a cup of water to a man whose left side moved less than the right. Cassidy laughing, quietly, as a nurse joked. Bramwell felt a tightening, a ledger set to close an unexpected account. He began to watch in a way he had never done before, not to confirm presence but to discover motive. The cameras were no longer tools of protection, but instruments that made the lives of others legible and thus liable to interpretation. He told himself he was preserving his daughter. He told himself that the ledger must be kept neat. But the more he looked, the more the images multiplied in ways that did not satisfy an accounting. The footage delivered human detail, a hand on a wheelchair, the press of a palm on hair, a laugh held for breath. Watching made these gestures look urgent and deliberate, in a way the people performing them would have called ordinary. The cameras answered nothing. They only handed him more things to weigh. Cassidy kept careful records the way seamstresses keep spare buttons. Nothing wasted, everything filed. When Bramwell found the journal he had not intended to find, his discovery felt accidental and small. He had been in the hall on his way to the kitchen. The monitors turned low, thought of making tea. In the sitting room the satchel lay where Cassidy had left it, the leather soft with recent use. The photograph had slipped further free. The corner of Marcus Webb's smile showed like a secret in the grass. He reached for the bag because the movement felt like holding an argument in his hands. He told himself he would return it. He did not expect to open the journal. The pages were close and intimate. They did not structure themselves as motives for manipulation. They were ledger-like, but in a different currency. Precise entries about exercises and repetitions, notes on Marcus's response to sensory cues, a list of organizations that might take him on for vocational training, names of volunteers who would teach woodwork, fragments of a letter Cassidy meant to send to someone who had abandoned a child. In one entry she wrote about a night she had stood in a doorway and not knocked, about how grief had sometimes required that she keep away until she was steady enough to stay. Her voice in ink read like a motion toward repair. She had photographed Marcus once when he smiled, she explained, because she wanted to remember what a whole expression looked like for someone who had seen his face break. He read, and the notation shifted in his chest. The ledger he kept in the study did not have a column for why. It had a place for cost, and a place for benefit, and a place for liability. This book behaved like a different kind of accounting, one that recorded acts that might be endemic and slow, care as a line item that appreciated with time. Bramwell's fingertips, the same ones that smoothed the photograph on his desk, hovered over Cassidy's handwriting as if he might be able to press it flat. There was a paragraph, in a cramped hand, where Cassidy had written about the lullaby. She had scrawled the first lines in Italian with shaky letters, then underlined them, and wrote that she had learned it from her nonna when the men she loved left, or when her own hands shook. She had written that songs could be proof of patience. She had written plainly that Marcus's eyes had once been bright, and that some part of him remained in the smile the photograph caught. Bramwell did not read much farther. He closed the book and, for a moment, felt as if the room itself had shifted on an axis. The cameras hummed on the wall. The blue light recorded everything. For the first time in years, the light unsettled him. He had installed his eyes to remove the possibility of friendly betrayal, and now found himself betrayed by the simple fact of seeing. The cameras had not changed the world. They had only given him a mirror that reflected his own interest back at him. He, who had counted movement and measured risk, discovered he had been watching to absolve himself. He left the satchel where it was, and stood by the window because the rain had started, soft at first, and then with the kind of insistence that made the cobbles shine like a ledger polished for scrutiny. From the security room he could see the terrace, a rectangle in which the water made its own accounting by pooling and running. The house smelled of boiled kettle and old wood. In the near distance, another light in the mansion across the way blinked like a distant star. Bramwell listened to the monitors and to the rain, and felt his own breathing respond to the notch of tide in his chest. If the cameras were a ledger, then looking was an entry. Each time he returned to the screen, he was narrating himself. He had believed that watching was distance. He was discovering that watching was confession. The screens did not keep secrets from him so much as they kept him honest about the things he had not yet admitted. The photograph in Cassidy's bag was not evidence of a plot. It was a trace of a history he had tried to bracket. The writing in the journal did not justify her actions so much as explain their texture, an ethic of presence, a practice of returning. He thought of the ways his hands had always been used, the firm closure of a deal, the paperwork slid across a table, the signature that resolved debate. Hands, as the journal reminded him in ink, were instruments of maintenance. Cassidy's hands were instruments of return. The difference mattered. He watched a clip where Cassidy knelt by Marcus on a bench in a rehabilitation yard and showed him, gently, how to lift a cup. Marcus's face worked like a map. Pale scar, cramped smile, something like humor around the edges. Bramwell had never been very good with people whose lives required slow patience. He was a man of immediate remedies, security, money, policy. The footage unsettled him because what he saw required time. It proposed that some repairs could not be purchased with ledgers alone. Bramwell's nights proceeded differently after that. He found himself sitting longer before the screens, less to tally than to witness. The blue light moved from being a means to an end, to a surface that reflected his own unpracticed tenderness. Sometimes he watched Addie and tried to translate his observation into care rather than provision. Sometimes he caught himself watching Cassidy as if she were an experiment in motive. The monitors delineated the possibilities and their shadows. There was another, smaller revelation that came without fanfare. On a rainy Thursday, Bramwell watched a feed that showed him in a reflection framed in monitor glass. He had been leaning over a console, one hand to his face, and the camera in the corridor had reflected that posture back to him. For a long moment he did not recognize the man in the glass. He saw only a silhouette of someone who watched others, so that he would not have to be watched. The image was a simple one. Bramwell in the act of watching himself reflected in the very instrument he trusted. It was as if the house had found a way to point its eyes inward. Watching himself made him feel both intruded upon and relieved. The cameras intended to shield had shown him what defense had obscured. The distance between him and the life he wanted to protect. He thought about the ledger and the children's toys and the kettle. He thought about how protection could calcify into ownership if unchecked. He found himself asking, not in his ledger, but in his chest, what it meant to keep something safe and what it meant to keep it whole. Cassidy continued her work with the steady rhythm of someone who had rehearsed patience until it became muscle. She documented small milestones, 20 seconds more of supported standing, the first controlled bite of mashed pear in weeks. She recorded the times Addie laughed at a wrong note on the piano. She wrote down the volunteers' names and their small idiosyncrasies, the one who whistled when he nailed a piece of wood, the woman who brought cold towels for headaches. Her journal was a catalogue of returns, not conquests. Yet even as Bramwell's chest loosened in places, suspicion had its own traction. It functioned like an old habit. He had been trained by a life of accounting to translate kindness into possibility for error. The photograph of Marcus was a punctuation mark he could not ignore. When one watches long enough, one begins to imagine narrative where perhaps only continuation exists. He made lists, quiet ones in his head, of what needed checking. He had a way of turning worry into action, but action for him usually meant things other than conversation. Now, with the journal laying new evidence at his feet, he had to reconcile what his eyes saw with what his hands wanted to do. One evening, after watching the lullaby clip twice, Bramwell closed the study door and walked the long, dark hall toward the stairs. The house felt like a body between rooms. Its breath was the boiler, its pulse the distant heat of the kitchen. He paused on the landing and looked down to the staff level where Cassidy's boots were often left by the door, where her satchel sometimes crouched. He found himself carrying the photograph in his pocket, the small folded image of Marcus's smile like contraband. The thumbprint on its corner was his own kind of denying. He had not yet decided how to repair the tension the cameras had made between his duty and his doubt. He suspected that simply turning off a camera would be performative and worse. It would be an erasure that left nothing behind. He suspected also that turning them fully on and reading them like scripture had done damage too. The house, for all its maps and measures, had no ready answer. As he descended the stairs, his footfalls measured. The lullaby, still hovering in his head, shaped itself into a memory of his own child's small, determined fists climbing the banister years ago. He found that memory almost embarrassing in its tenderness. He had raised walls for protection. He had meant those walls to be boundaries between his daughter and harm. He had not anticipated that the walls might become a way to keep her from the world she would need. At the base of the staircase he encountered Cassidy by chance. She was carrying a basket with linens, tired but poised. Addie's bedroom door was ajar. Inside, the piano keys reflected the blue glow that still seeped from the monitors upstairs. Cassidy looked up, and for a half-second their eyes met. Bramwell felt the weight of everything he had watched condense into that tiny collision of glances. "Mr. Rossy," she said, steady as the pages in her notebook. Her voice had the same plainness as her handwriting. "Bramwell," he answered, less formality now because titles made a distance he no longer wanted to keep. He could have spoken of his concerns, of the photograph, of the feeds. He could have asked her to explain herself, to account for the tenderness she brought into the rooms he had protected. Instead, he found himself holding a question that was harder than any record he kept. "Why Marcus?" he heard himself ask, and the words were burdensome. Cassidy set the basket down, folded her hands like someone aware that the world had quieted around them. For a moment she did not speak. The pause was not evasive. It was the preparation one gives to a truth that is not easy or rhetorical. "He was at the clinic before," she said finally. "And then he wasn't." Her voice had a private tremor. "He needed someone to keep showing up. I don't know how to do anything else but show up." The straightforwardness of it struck him. The ledger in his head refused the simplicity and clawed for complication. Showing up, as a line item, had no clear cost-benefit calculation. It asked only that a person be present, repeatedly, and that presence required the slow erosion of habit. Bramwell, who had spent a lifetime making immediate decisions that shifted lines on a page, had never had to measure the moral economy of showing up. He could have made her justify her motives. He could have treated the photograph as proof of a plot, or he could have asked for the cameras to be checked for evidence he believed would exonerate him. Instead, the watchful man found himself considering a different account. What if protection required being in the room, not watching it from a safe distance? What if the very instruments he had trusted to absolve him were the thing that kept him away from the work of repair? Cassidy's eyes were not asking to be forgiven. They asked only to be seen. Bramwell felt the old instruments of his life, ledgers, men, strategies, shift under him like a foundation not entirely trusted. In that shift there was both threat and possibility. He had made a career of ensuring control. Now the house asked that he consider care. He left the stairwell with no decision made, but carrying a new form of unease. He went back to the security room, to the constellation of screens, and for a long while watched the monitors not to gather evidence, but to practice being present without acting. The exercise felt unfamiliar and necessary. Watching had always been a defense. He had to learn what patience looked like when it was not simply another way of keeping watch. On the screen, Addie turned in her sleep and the photocopy of a lullaby in Cassidy's notebook fluttered where someone had left it open. Bramwell's thumb found the photograph in his pocket and smoothed its corner again, this time with an absence of accusation. He did not know what to do next. He did not know whether meeting a man like Marcus in a fluorescent room would be a gesture or a trap. He had not yet decided whether the cameras would remain the house's eyes or be converted into something else. But watching, he realized, was choosing a side. The side of calculation or the side of attendance. Outside, the rain washed the street down to shine. The monitors hummed and the lullaby threaded itself into the blue. Bramwell turned the feed off and left the room with the photograph still heavy in his pocket and the taste of song in his mouth. He had learned something that watching had not meant to teach him, that protection could be mirror as much as guard, that to watch was sometimes to be seen. He imagined a ledger that included fingers and hands and hours spent sitting with someone who needed time. The idea felt like an unfamiliar currency. He paused by the doorway to Addie's room, listening to the small mechanical noises a body made at rest, and thought of the stairwell where he had not yet raised the questions that asked for more than records. The house was quiet. The cameras, for the moment, were inert on the wall. Their lenses reflected his silhouette back like another portrait. He had the photograph, the journal, and the knowledge that watching had rearranged him. He had no plan and no quick absolution. He only had a choice to make, and choices against a life of habit sometimes began with a single action that was smaller than the ledger, but larger than a single night. He folded the photograph once more and placed it carefully in his pocket. Then he turned away from the room where the screen slept, walked down the corridor with the soft hum of the house in his ears, and climbed the stairs toward the place where Cassidy would be finishing her shift, and where words he had not yet shaped waited for the right set of hands to unfold. He found her where the stairwell narrowed into the service corridor, the light there always a little dimmer, as if the house felt the need to conserve its cheer for the rooms that earned it. Addie's door was open. The piano's white keys caught a stray beam and flashed like coins. Cassidy sat on the bottom step, basket at her feet, hands folded around a towel that still smelled of starch and lemon. She looked up without surprise, the lines at the corners of her eyes steady, as if the eyes had practice at being lucid under pressure. Addie was behind Cassidy, propped in a chair with a blanket over her legs. She had been awake, Bramwell realized, and now she cried, a small startled sound that broke somewhere behind the sternum. It was not the keening that once led men to make appointments with fate. It was a small private alarm, the body's way of clearing itself. Cassidy murmured something, less a sentence than a small note, and slipped a hand over Addie's fingers. The music of the lullaby lived in the cadence of that hand. Bramwell paused at the top of the stairs and felt, with a clarity that made his joints ache, the difference between being present and being present at a distance. The monitors were upstairs, a constellation he could fold his life around. Below him, the world asked for different kinds of answers. He started down the stairs and the house seemed to hold its breath. Cassidy watched him now with an assessment he had not expected. Not fear, not supplication, but a quiet appraisal of whether he would come closer or sink back into the pattern of observation. "You can watch us," she said when he was 2 steps away, voice low and without flourish. "Or you can be with us." The sentence landed like a coin on a ledger, simple, final. In the silence it rang more like a bell than an accusation. Addie's hand closed, half reflex, on Cassidy's finger. Bramwell's thumb, the same one that smoothed paper for comfort or signature, found the edge of the photograph in his pocket and rubbed it until the paper softened. He had imagined confrontation would be a negotiation of facts, who had been where, what the photographs meant, whether proximity equaled conspiracy. Cassidy offered no exculpation nor demand for forgiveness. She had already done the work of naming what she wanted, what she believed the work of repair required. The room did not need an interrogation. It needed a set of mutual commitments. "What do you want?" Bramwell asked, and the phrasing surprised him, less why than what. It was harder to measure. Cassidy's reply was a list spoken without flourish, each point articulated like a proposal she had thought through at 3 in the morning in the staff car. "I want money for Marcus's vocational training, not charity but a structured apprenticeship. I want the house's security policies reviewed. Less eyes on bedrooms, more investment in community programs. I want you to come to 1 therapy session for Addie a week. And I want the cameras in the living space, and Addie's room disconnected, with the monitors repurposed for something that makes things instead of watching them." She said the last one quietly, as if it could be taken for granted, but it was the sentence that rearranged the room. Turning monitors into something that made workbenches, painting tables, screens for sharing community memos, felt subversive in a way Bramwell had not anticipated. It proposed that the house be unlearned in the same slow way a body relearns a limb after injury. "You want me to fund?" he began, and the ledger in his head opened reflexively. How much? What mechanism? What oversight? For years his reply to unease had been in numbers, accounts, trust funds, stipends, but Cassidy wasn't asking for a one-off erasure. Her list was not a receipt for guilt. It was an outline of presence. "Not to buy her off," Cassidy said sharply. "To build a scaffolding that holds people when steady hands are needed. Marcus can learn a trade. He can be paid an apprentice wage. The center needs a proper shop. They need tools. They need people who will stay." Bramwell's first instinct, one born from a lifetime of thinking in margins, was to ask about guarantees. Cassidy met that with the kind of answer that only practice makes true. "We'll sign a partnership agreement. There will be oversight. But money without presence is a bandage." Her gaze moved then to Addie, and softened in a way no ledger could capture. "You can fund from a distance, or you can fund and come." The house, Bramwell thought, offered him 1,000 ways to deflect. He could sign checks and stay behind the console, watching the numbers settle like dust. He could thread money through programs and keep the blue light on. He could maintain his distance and call it prudence. He also knew, because the journal had shown him, because the monitors had returned his reflection to him, that distance had its own cruelty. Watching excused the avoidance of clumsy, embarrassing human tasks, changing a dressing, wiping spilt food, learning how to fit a brace. Presence would ask him to be inelegant and constant. He chose action that night with his typical mixture of bluntness and hesitation. He did not sign away his entire life, but he opened rooms. First, a bank account in the name of a small foundation tied to Addie's care with a designated line for vocational work at the Eastern District Rehabilitation Center. Second, an agreement with the center that would fund a woodshop, a program coordinator, and a small stipend for apprentices including Marcus. Cassidy drew up a framework that was practical and unforgiving. Accountability meetings, quarterly reviews, obligations for his representatives to attend 2 public sessions a year. It was a ledger he could look at and trust, because it had structure. But he agreed to one thing she insisted on that had no table, his own weekly presence in Addie's therapy. He signed with the same hand that had signed dismissals and acquisitions. The ink looked absurdly small beside the weight of the decision. He felt the old competence. Numbers obeyed him. But he also felt an unfamiliar vertigo. He had committed himself to tasks that could not be resolved with signatures alone. The first meeting at the center was not cinematic. There was no camera crew, no fanfare, only fluorescent light and the smell of floor polish. Bramwell arrived alone, leaving the stretch of men and numbers at home like a folded garment. He sat in a linoleum chair across from a man who ran the vocational program, and both of them spoke in measured, practical tones. Marcus was there, but not immediately introduced. He came out slowly from the workshop, a man guarded and accustomed to being assessed, his hands thick with the calluses of someone who had had to do his own repairs. Bramwell watched Marcus with the same economy he had used to watch monitors, but there was a difference. He could choose to stand up and reach out. He did not know how to do that without posture or entourage to soften or justify him. He offered no absolutions. He offered, awkwardly and plainly, a place to learn and a stipend for the work. Marcus looked at the paper like it belonged to someone else's life. He had been small in the files Bramwell had seen, a clipped paragraph, a scrawled article that had fixed him in print for an incident that took more than facts to explain. Up close, he was a man who measured openings as if they might shut at any moment. When Bramwell spoke, "We're going to give you a job at the shop," the words landed in a way that asked for a decision Marcus had not expected to make. There was suspicion. There was curiosity. There was a stare that read Bramwell like an account he had been avoiding. Marcus accepted on slow terms, the kind that required trial and return. "I'll come 3 days a week," he said, and Bramwell felt the tiny victory of language that asked for next steps rather than absolution. Back at the house, technicians arrived the next week to begin the work Cassidy had demanded. Bramwell sat in the security room, feeling the blue like a presence around him, as the men unhooked cables and labeled them, as one by one the monitors dimmed and the hum shifted. There was an odd modesty in the act, screens going dark in a room that had once been a starfield. He did not watch them do it. He turned his back to the wall of glass until the last bulb went out, and the room felt, in its new dimness, like the inside of a closed book. He repurposed the room himself in fits and starts. The first time he carried a box of old tools in, his hands felt unpracticed, almost juvenile. His fists wrapped incorrectly around a hammer until a volunteer showed him how to grip it. He sanded in the wrong direction, held a nail at the wrong angle. He cursed under his breath, not at pain but at clumsiness. Cassidy laughed once, discreetly, as if to make sure he would not stop by embarrassment. He kept showing up. Those acts, small and clumsy, were the true measure of his change. He made no great speeches about reparation. He simply learned to hold a cup steady, to read the spaces a body needed, and to allow them. Addie noticed. She began, slowly and without ceremony, to place her palm against his when he sat beside her during therapy, the skin a map of familiarity and unfamiliar softness. Bramwell, who had once led men by the firmness of a jaw, found himself listening to the cadence of another person's breathing and learning to slow his so it would not frighten them. There were mistakes. He overreached one morning, trying to help with a transfer, and his attempt, well-meaning but inexperienced, left Addie unsettled. Her cry that day dug into him like poor accounting. He apologized aloud, clumsy and immediate, and sat on the edge of the bed until she allowed him to fold her blanket again. He fumbled with the formula for a feeding, spilling it onto the sheets, and then learned, patient and silent, how to smooth the mess without fear. Presence had no dignity. It had repetition. Marcus's arc was equally unromantic. The shop became a place not of instant redemption, but of apprenticeship, the repetition of planing, the careful measuring, the slow building of a table regarded in the woodshop as a kind of small victory. Bramwell visited sometimes, took the bus once when schedules did not allow his car to be practical, and he learned the hum of a planer and the smell of sawdust. Marcus watched him watch, then, one afternoon, handed him a block of wood and a chisel. Bramwell's hands, the hand that had once signed off on distant violence or settlement, trembled as he cut. He learned to measure the wood with more patience than he had ever measured a balance sheet. There were conversations too, awkward, brief. Marcus did not insist on backstory. He preferred the present. Bramwell often found himself apologizing in ways that were more about listening than confession. "I'm here," he learned to say. Rarely did he say, "I'm sorry." The difference mattered because "I'm here" was a promise that could be kept daily. Cassidy's demands rippled outward. The community center used the shop money to add evening classes. Men and women came to learn a trade rather than to be processed as cases. Volunteers stayed. Some people who had once been wary of rooms with cameras now came because doors were open and hands were busy. The local police liaison, a man Bramwell had met once in the margins of his old life, sat reluctantly in a meeting that Cass had organized, a public forum about the kinds of interventions that could prevent escalations. Bramwell did not dominate the room. He listened as residents recounted small harms and asked for sustained presence from institutions. There were no miracles. The Eastern District still bore its scars. Some neighborhood resentments could not be paid away. But the tone shifted from transactional meetings to ongoing ones, the kind that require people to show up on Thursdays and keep their chairs warm. That consistency had an effect. Fewer spontaneous interventions that demanded crisis, more scheduled support that required patience. Bramwell learned the difference between being a sponsor and being a participant, and he preferred the harder role. At home, the monitors that had once hung like constellations were now a single wall of reclaimed wood and canvas. The room smelled of sawdust and oil-based paint. A long workbench held notebooks, wood shavings, a radio that played station music with no political talk. Bramwell painted in a corner, clumsy and deliberate, and one day found he had left a smear of color on his trouser leg. The smear became, to others, a kind of absurd badge, proof that he had been hands-on, that he had not merely directed, but had dirtied himself. Addie's milestones were small and contained. The first time she pushed a toy with 2 fingers and watched it roll, she made a sound like a small triumph that lifted the room. The first time she managed 5 steps with the walker, Bramwell stood at the threshold and felt as if the world had tilted in the right direction by a single degree. He clapped with the awkward enthusiasm of someone not used to celebrating such things, and Cassidy laughed, wet-eyed and quick, as if the joy of the moment was both relief and currency. The repurposed surveillance room hosted community nights where men from the neighborhood came to learn how to use tools, where volunteers taught resume writing and interview skills, and where people who had been brought up on suspicion had a space to practice being seen without fear. The room did not eradicate the house's history or Bramwell's past, but it converted the language of looking into a language of making. Not all responses were welcome. Some of Bramwell's old associates treated his actions as weakness. Rumors threaded through a few corners of the city that he was softening. Other whispers said he had simply found a way to launder conscience. Bramwell paid some attention to those whispers and less attention to others. He had not given up protection entirely. He had only changed its form. He still signed for security at times, but he also made it his business to fund different programs, to ask his staff to attend community meetings rather than clear community concerns by fiat. Cassidy's journal continued to be a touchstone. Bramwell read it occasionally, not to find redemption for himself, but to keep the texture of another life under his skin. In one passage, she described a morning when Marcus had laughed at a misaligned board and cursed the planer in a way that was almost tender. She wrote simply, "He laughed for 5 seconds straight, and the sound was a place to stand." Bramwell copied the line in his head like a budget that finally balanced, not in dollars, but in human terms. There were clumsy tests of faith. Bramwell volunteered once to attend a group therapy session at the center with Cassidy and a small contingent of staff. He sat through stories of loss and restitution, of days when small acts of kindness had changed a life. He said little. His presence initially spoke for him. People watched how he listened and how he did not redirect the conversation to his ledger. Over time, his attendance itself became a currency of reliability. He missed sessions sometimes, fell back into habit, but then returned, and the return mattered more than consistency in a single week. Marcus's relationship to Bramwell evolved with the pace of work in a shop. Measured cuts, imperfect planes, sanded edges. One afternoon, Marcus brought Bramwell a small wooden box he had made. The lid fit imperfectly, but the joints held. Marcus said, without drama, "Thought you might like this." Bramwell held it like an offering, a box that did not require ceremony and that did not ask for payment. He put it on the reclaimed workbench as if it were a literal deposit of trust. Addie's progress continued. She began to hum at times, the lullaby slipping out of her in a partial memory. Bramwell learned, with an awkward tenderness, to match the timing of her breath when he read to her. He learned to accept that repair would be slow, that a decade of distance and hardened habits had consequences that no single act could rectify. There were setbacks. An outreach program faltered when a coordinator left unexpectedly, leaving gaps in supervision that required rapid patchwork. Bramwell wrote checks in the night to keep things afloat while Cassidy found a new person to take the role. He apologized in a different register than he had before, not simply by adding funds, but by sitting in the center's office at 6 a.m., folding community flyers and learning how to place them so volunteers would answer calls. To his people, his staff, it looked messy. To Bramwell, it was a lesson in humility. The cameras continued to be a motif in his life, even when turned off. Sometimes he would stand in the repurposed room and run his hand along the black frames where lenses had once been, feeling the cool metal like an old scar. He pressed his palm to one dead screen. The glass had been left intentionally as a reminder that watching had been a practice, and he smudged the surface with paint until his hand left an imperfect print. The mark became, for a while, a small ritual, proof that his hands had been used for making, instead of merely signing. Cassidy's conditions also included formal steps. The policies that governed staff searches, the protocols around family privacy, the requirement that cameras could not be in personal bedrooms without explicit, revocable consent. The policies were not dramatic. They read like good municipal housekeeping. Bramwell agreed to them, and more importantly, to their enforcement. He could have insisted on exceptions. He did not. Time passed in a way that felt like a conversion of habits rather than a renovation. Years, measured in small acts and monthly reports, made things less brittle. Marcus's apprenticeship ended with him taking a job at a local furniture co-op. Steady, paid, enough to keep him off the more precarious edges of the city. He began, occasionally, to come to the house and help in the workshops as part of the center's outreach. He did not become a different man overnight. He became, incrementally, a man with more options. Community mornings at the repurposed room became traditions: scones, sanding, a kettle always on. Bramwell, who once had kept his hands clean to preserve his authority, found contentment in the tactile labor of being useful. Children who once learned to fear gates began to come into the repurposed house for craft lessons, and when they left they did so with a small wooden toy and a lesson not about fear, but about how to make something with your hands. The house's external image did not change much in the city's gossip. Some continued to call him a maker of fear, others a late convert. Bramwell grew used to both. He had, in private, developed a tolerance for the discomfort of being watched by the public as atonement. That discomfort was not a punishment. It was part of a life rearranged to include accountability. There were moments that could have been made into speeches about transformation, but were better left small. On an autumn morning when the leaves made the drive a map of burnt color, Addie managed a phrase, 2 words strung clumsily but with intention. Bramwell, who had spent evenings reading about balance sheets and other men's strengths, wept without ceremony behind the door. He did not tell anyone initially. The tears felt private as a prayer. Later he told Cassidy with a laugh that had a crack in it, and she told him to keep his shirt clean because theatrics were not useful in care. His shirt never fully recovered from the salt of that morning. Near the end of the second year there was a public ceremony at the community center, a modest ribbon cutting for the newly furnished shop built with the funds he had committed. They invited local volunteers, the center's staff, some neighborhood representatives, and a small group of journalists. Bramwell stood at a distance and watched faces he had only read before, now become familiar. The man who led fitness classes for recovering addicts, the woman who taught resume skills, the teenagers who came on Saturdays to learn carpentry. Marcus, now an employee, gave the speech. His voice did not tremble. He thanked the people who had shown up over and over. He thanked the center. He did not mention Bramwell directly, but his thanks was big enough to fold him in. The cameras were not mentioned. They did not need to be. Everyone understood that old modes of protection had been made into new ones. Bramwell's signature sat somewhere on a foundation document, but more visible were the hands of people who had learned to make something, to meet someone, and to stay. The real test came in domestic spaces. Bramwell learned to listen to a different kind of ledger, the one his daughter's body kept. It tallied small gains and minor regressions. He learned to measure effort instead of outcome. When Addie's walking was interrupted by a pain flare-up, he sat with her in the study and read aloud until she slept. He helped her relearn the timing of a breath when an anxious thought took hold. Those were the days the monitors would have been most tempting, but he had already learned what an old watchfulness could cost. A year into his new pattern, Bramwell took an afternoon off his weekly visits to the center and walked through the Eastern District markets to the little pastry shop where Cassidy's Nona had once said she learned the lullaby. On impulse, he bought a packet of biscotti and went to find Cassidy in the staff kitchen. She was there, stirring at a pot, and when she turned, she smiled in a way that no ledger had ever allowed him to buy. He sat down and offered the biscotti like a trivial offering that nevertheless meant something. They did not speak of the past conspiracies their monitors once suggested. They spoke instead of mundane things: an errand that had gone wrong, a neighbor's cat that kept stealing yarn. At night, Bramwell sometimes dreamed in blue light, the monitors returning to him in the wrong order, and sometimes in green where the shop's benches lined up like a small fleet. He used to wake with the old defense mechanisms ready. Now they took longer to assert themselves and were easier to lay down. There were nights of doubt, of course. He missed old certainties. He missed the clean efficiency of contracts that ended problems at a stroke. But he also had evenings when Addie's hands found his and held on, and a wooden box sat on the workbench like a small, solid statement that things could be made useful again. Years had a way of softening the edges, not erasing them. The repurposed surveillance room eventually held canvases and tools, and a small radio that played not just news. In a corner, a photograph of Marcus's smile, one Cassidy had taped back together long ago, was framed and propped like a relic. Bramwell touched that frame sometimes, fingers lingering on glass that had once been used for watching and now preserved a moment of human things made whole enough to hang. The epilogue came in modest pieces. On a spring morning with the scent of cut grass and something like celebration in the air, Addie navigated the garden path with a walker and crossed from the rosebed to the little fountain without assistance. She did it slowly, chin set, and when she reached the stone she laughed, a sound that felt like a bell. The people on the terrace applauded as if they had been rehearsing for nothing dramatic. Bramwell stood at the edge and felt his chest unclench as if a contract had been fulfilled without fanfare. There was a small recital that evening in the repurposed room. Children played a simple tune on the piano. Marcus made a shelf and put it on display, proud and quiet. Bramwell had a smear of paint on his heel and a new callus on his thumb. He listened to the music and to Cassidy's soft hum of the lullaby at the end, and something in him shifted into a place that was not ledgers or defense, but attendance. After the recital, when the house had been folded back into its domestic quiet and the guests had left, Bramwell went to the workbench. The old security monitor, now painted over, hung on the wall as a canvas. He pressed his palm to the glass. The paint was still wet and left a smudge he could not scrub away. He laughed softly, a sound without triumph, and then put his forehead against the cool frame as if to take a breath. Below, in the room where Addie slept, she turned in her bed and hummed the partial tune of the lullaby. Bramwell listened without needing to reconcile. The cameras, which he had once believed would keep danger at bay, had done something else entirely. They had shown him the ledger of his own heart. Watching had taught him that the account that mattered was not one of threat and defense, but of small acts kept faithfully. He had moved imperfectly, from purchase to presence. He had not erased his past. He had learned to allow it to be seen and to be worked against by banal, daily labor. He continued to be a man with complicated motives. He was not absolved. But he had begun the slow, repetitive work of repair, the kind that requires you to be present when it's boring, when it's messy, when people do not thank you. He had traded the exalted architecture of protection for the stubborn, uncaptivating architecture of care. The house kept its own memory. There were evenings when the repurposed room hummed with the sound of a hand plane and a radio, the rhythm of making. The city beyond still carried its own struggles, and the Eastern District still had scars. But there was now a small shop where someone could learn a trade, an afternoon program that gave kids a place to make toys rather than fight over them, a handful of volunteers who showed up on rain days, and a man who pressed his smudged hand against a dead screen and would, from time to time, return to the very posture he had once used to watch others, to instead measure how he might be accountable. On a late, cool evening, Bramwell sat in the doorway of Addie's room and watched the streetlights play on wet cobblestones. The blue glow of the monitors was gone. In its place, close domestic sounds, tea kettle, a page turned, the faint hum of the workbench radio, made a living score. He thought for a long moment about the original hope that had led him to install 100 eyes. He had wanted proof. He had thought proof would shield him from the anxiety of randomness. Instead, he had found that the proof the world offered was not an exculpation, but a mirror. The last image he carried, and the one he kept returning to when decisions whispered for him to abdicate responsibility, was small and simple, a thumb tracing the corner of a photograph. He thought of that thumb in Cassidy's satchel and in his own pocket, and how repeated gestures, gentle, insistent, patient, could become a different kind of accounting. He thought of the lullaby's Italian vowel that braided itself through rooms and changed the hum of the house. He thought of Marcus fitting dovetails in the shop, Addie taking a walker step, Cassidy folding a towel with hands that had learned both tenderness and boundary. The cameras had been installed to protect his daughter. They had done that in a narrow, literal way. They had kept watch while he was absent. But what they had done more consequentially was to reveal him to himself. Watching had compelled him to reckon not just with possibility of external harm, but with the cost of his own defenses. The monitors became a mirror that required change. In the end, the moral of the house was not in a single act of contrition or performance. It lived in the slow accumulation of small acts, showing up at the center on Thursdays, sanding a board with a man who once fit his life into a clipped file, learning to keep his palms steady for a child who needed him to be predictable. The camera's blue light had been the first teacher of his humility. The workbench had become the classroom. He left the room softly, and as he closed the door, he did not look back to see whether the monitor glass held his reflection. He turned instead toward the sound of a kettle and a piano note that sagged into the night like a promise. He had not purchased absolution. He had not been cleansed by money. He had been altered, imperfectly, patiently, by the slow and often messy law of being there. If you watched until the end, Bramwell's question, "What would you do if protection turned back on you?" remains the same. Do you choose the ledger or the labor? Tell us in the comments which moment moved you most. And if you want more stories like this, subscribe for the next long-form narrative.